Arizona Territory, 1875. The unforgiving sun beat down on the cracked earth of the Sonoran Desert, turning the air itself into a shimmering mirage. It was land contested by many, Apache and white settler alike, but owned truly by none. In this merciless borderland between civilization and wilderness, Luke Westfield had convinced himself of one undeniable truth. A man who opens his heart on the frontier is simply digging his own grave. Luke adjusted his worn leather gloves as he guided his horse through the narrow canyon. At 25, he had already lived several lifetimes' worth of hardship. The war had taken his father, the drought had taken his family's Texas ranch, and the frontier had taken his innocence. His handsome features, square jaw, clear blue eyes, and sandy brown hair that curled slightly at the nape of his neck, masked a soul that had hardened like the desert floor beneath his horse's hooves. "Just you and me, Dun," Luke muttered to his dun-colored gelding. "Safer that way." The horse snorted in seeming agreement as they followed the narrow trail between towering red rock walls. Luke had been riding for Arizona Cattle Company for 3 years now, moving herds across territory where Apache raids, outlaws, and the elements themselves conspired to separate a man from his life. He'd seen cowboys who'd gone soft over a pretty face end up face down in the dirt. Luke had silently promised himself never to make that mistake. What Luke wanted was simple. Earn enough to buy a small spread of his own, where he could live by his own rules and answer to no man. What he secretly needed, though he'd sooner take a bullet than admit it, was to fill the aching emptiness that had followed him since watching his mother and sisters board an eastbound train, returning to family in Boston after his father's death. Luke had stayed behind, too stubborn and too proud to admit defeat. The canyon opened to a small valley and Luke paused, removing his hat to wipe sweat from his brow. That's when he heard it, the unmistakable crack of a rifle shot echoing off the canyon walls, followed by the sound he'd learned to dread most on the frontier. A woman's scream. Luke's first instinct was to ride on, not his fight, not his problem. The desert was littered with the bones of heroes, but something, perhaps his mother's voice in his head speaking of duty and honor, made him curse under his breath as he turned dun toward the sound, drawing his Winchester from its scabbard. What he found beyond a cluster of mesquite trees changed everything. An overturned wagon lay beside a small creek, one wheel still spinning lazily. Near it, a man's body sprawled unnaturally on the ground. And crouched behind a rock, rifle in hand, was a young woman firing desperately at 3 mounted attackers circling the wreckage. Luke assessed the situation in seconds. Road agents, likely, the sort who preyed on isolated travelers. Without hesitation, he raised his rifle and fired twice, unseating one attacker. The others turned, spotted him, and decided the odds had shifted unfavorably. They fired a few wild shots before galloping away. Only when the dust settled did Luke truly see the woman who emerged from behind the rocks. She wore a simple calico dress, now torn and stained with dust and what looked like blood. Her hair, black as a midnight sky and woven into a long braid, framed a face of striking beauty. High cheekbones, full lips, and eyes that held both fear and fierce determination. She couldn't have been more than 22, but those eyes had seen more than most twice her age. She was Apache. The realization hit Luke like a physical blow, an Apache woman alone, defending herself with deadly precision. Her mixed-blood heritage was evident in her features, the blending of worlds that made her an outsider to both. "You are hurt," she said, her English clear but accented. It wasn't a question but an observation as she pointed to Luke's arm where a bullet had grazed him. "It's nothing," Luke replied, suddenly aware of the burning sensation along his bicep. "Your husband," he gestured toward the fallen man. "My brother," she corrected, her voice tightening with grief. "He is dead." There was no visible emotion beyond a slight narrowing of her eyes, but Luke sensed an ocean of pain beneath her composed exterior. She knelt beside her brother's body, murmuring words in Apache that Luke couldn't understand but recognized as a prayer. "I am Gabriela Asah," she said when she finished, rising to her feet. "My brother was bringing me to town. Our mother was white, married to our father before the Troubles. We were going to her people." She spoke matter-of-factly, as though explaining the weather rather than the circumstances that had left her brother dead and her alone in Apache territory where she would be trusted by neither side. "Luke Westfield," he responded. "I ride for Arizona Cattle Company." He hesitated, knowing what duty and decency required but fighting against his own rule of not getting involved. "I can't leave you out here. There's a ranch about 10 miles west where we can bring your brother." "I will not leave him for the animals," Gabriela said firmly. Luke nodded, understanding. "We'll bury him proper, then I'll take you to town." As they worked together to dig a grave in the hard earth, Luke found himself studying Gabriela. She worked without complaint, her movements efficient and graceful despite her grief. When they had laid her brother to rest, she placed a small carved wooden figure, a horse, in his hands before they covered him with earth. "He made beautiful things from wood," she explained, catching Luke's curious glance. "He believed he would ride to the ancestors." Night fell quickly in the desert. With the grave marked by stones and the wagon beyond repair, Luke built a small fire. Gabriela sat across from him, the flames illuminating her face. She had washed the dust and blood away in the creek, and Luke was struck again by her beauty, a beauty that seemed to belong to the land itself. "Where will you go now?" Luke asked, passing her a tin cup of coffee. "My mother had a sister in Tucson," Gabriela replied, "but I have never met these people. I do not know if they will welcome a half-Apache niece they have never seen." "They're your family," Luke said, though he knew the world wasn't that simple. Gabriela's dark eyes met his across the fire. "Family is not always blood, Mr. Westfield. Family is who stands beside you when the bullets fly." Something in her words pierced the armor Luke had built around himself. He looked away, uncomfortable with the feeling. "You should sleep," he said gruffly. "We'll ride at first light." But sleep eluded Luke as he kept watch, his mind filled with the image of Gabriela fighting alone against overwhelming odds. She had shown more courage than most men he'd known. When dawn broke, they mounted done together, Gabriela sitting behind Luke, her arms reluctantly circling his waist for balance. Luke told himself he would simply deliver her to Tucson and be on his way. He had a job to return to, cattle to move. Getting involved in someone else's troubles was exactly what he'd sworn never to do. The ranch where Luke stopped first belonged to his employer. The foreman, Thompson, eyed Gabriela with suspicion when Luke explained what had happened. "Apache, huh?" Thompson said, spitting tobacco juice into the dirt. "Even half-breeds bring trouble, Westfield. You know the situation with the reservations." "She's a woman who just buried her brother," Luke responded, his voice hardening. "She needs help getting to her family in Tucson." "You're due back with the herd in 3 days," Thompson reminded him. "Boss won't like you playing escort." "I'll be there," Luke promised. What he didn't say was that he felt responsible for Gabriela now. He couldn't explain it, but the thought of simply leaving her to make her own way felt wrong in ways he couldn't articulate. They left the ranch with fresh supplies and continued westward. As they rode, Gabriela gradually shared more of her story. Her father had been a respected Apache leader who had tried to forge peace with the whites, marrying a settler's daughter as part of his commitment to finding a way for their peoples to coexist. Both parents had died of fever when Gabriela was 16, leaving her and her brother caught between worlds, too Apache for white society, too influenced by white ways for traditional Apache life. "My father believed the future would belong to those who could walk in both worlds," she explained. "He taught us to read English books but also to know the old ways. My brother was trying to honor that by bringing me to our mother's people." "And what do you believe?" Luke asked. Gabriela was silent for a long moment. "I believe home is not a place," she finally said. "It is where you are understood." The simple wisdom of her words stayed with Luke as they made camp that night. He found himself sharing his own story, his father's death in the war, his mother's return east, his determination to make his own way in the West. "So you are also between worlds," Gabriela observed, "not belonging fully to either." Luke had never thought of it that way, but she was right. He had rejected his mother's Eastern world, but had yet to truly find his place in the West. He was a drifter belonging nowhere and to no one. The realization was uncomfortable, At least I look the part, he said defensively. You have it harder. Perhaps, she acknowledged, but I know who I am, Luke Westfield. Do you? Her question haunted him as he took the first watch that night. Who was he really? A cowboy with no roots, no family, no home beyond the next paycheck. He had been so focused on survival, on not needing anyone, that he'd never stopped to consider what he was surviving for. The next day brought trouble. As they forded a shallow river, 3 riders appeared on the opposite bank. Luke recognized them immediately, the road agents who had attacked Gabriela and her brother. "Well, look who it is," called the leader, a scarred man with a matted beard, "the half-breed and her knight. Thought you'd be long gone by now." Luke's hand moved to his revolver. "Ride on," he called back. "There's nothing here worth dying for." The leader laughed. "That's where you're wrong, cowboy. That Apache witch killed my brother, and I aim to settle that debt." "Your brother died trying to rob and murder innocent travelers," Luke replied, his voice steady though his heart hammered in his chest. "I'd say he got what he deserved." The men spread out, clearly planning to attack. Luke whispered to Gabriela, "When I move, you run for those rocks, don't look back." "I will not leave you," she whispered back. "I told you, family stands together." Before Luke could argue, the first shots rang out. He returned fire, diving from the horse and pulling Gabriela down with him into the shallow water for cover. Dunn bolted away from the gunfire. What followed was a desperate firefight. Luke and Gabriela, pinned down in the river, exchanging shots with the bandits who had the advantage of higher ground. A bullet grazed Luke's cheek, another tore through his sleeve. But 2 of the attackers fell to their combined fire before the leader, realizing he was now alone, retreated with a shouted promise of vengeance. They emerged from the water, soaked and shaking with spent adrenaline. Luke touched his bleeding cheek, wincing. "You are a good shot," he said to Gabriela, who was examining a bullet hole in her skirt where the lead had passed through fabric without touching flesh. "My father taught me," she replied. Then, her composure finally breaking, she began to laugh, a sound of relief, of surviving when death had seemed certain. Luke found himself joining her, the laughter releasing the tension of the past hours. When their laughter subsided, Gabriela stepped closer, reaching up to touch the cut on his cheek. The contact sent a jolt through Luke that had nothing to do with pain. "Thank you," she said softly, "for standing with me." "You did the same," Luke replied, acutely aware of her proximity, of the water droplets clinging to her eyelashes. For a moment the world narrowed to just her face, her eyes meeting his with an intensity that made breathing difficult. The moment broke when they heard hoofbeats approaching. Both turned, weapons ready, only to see Dunn returning cautiously to the riverbank. "Smart horse," Luke commented, grateful for the interruption that allowed him to regain his composure. What was happening to him? This wasn't part of the plan. They continued their journey, making slower progress now that they were sharing a horse and avoiding main trails for fear of another ambush. That night, as they camped in a sheltered arroyo, Luke found himself telling Gabriela about his dreams of owning land. "Just a small spread," he explained, "enough for some cattle and horses. A place that's mine." "Land does not belong to us," Gabriela replied thoughtfully. "We belong to the land. This is what my father taught. The Apache do not own the earth, we are part of it." "That's a fine philosophy," Luke said, "but it doesn't stop ranchers from fencing in every acre they can claim." "And does this make them happy?" she asked. "To put borders around pieces of earth." Luke had no ready answer. He had always assumed that owning land would bring contentment, security. But looking at the stars through Gabriela's eyes, he wondered if he had been chasing the wrong dream all along. They reached Tucson 2 days later, a dusty frontier town where adobe buildings stood alongside newer wooden structures. Luke was acutely aware of the looks they received, a cowboy and a half-Apache woman riding double on a tired horse. Gabriela sat straighter, her face a mask of dignity despite the stares and whispers. Finding Gabriela's aunt proved more difficult than anticipated. The address they had was outdated. After several inquiries, they learned that Martha Benson, Gabriela's aunt, had remarried and moved to a small house at the edge of town. Luke felt an unexpected weight in his chest as they approached the modest home. His task was nearly complete. He would deliver Gabriela to her family and return to his job, to the life he had carved out for himself. It was what he wanted, wasn't it? A gray-haired woman answered their knock, her eyes widening as she took in the unlikely pair before her. "Mrs. Benson?" Luke asked. "Martha Benson." "It's Martha Carroll now," she corrected, her gaze fixed on Gabriela. "Who are you?" "My name is Gabriela Asah," Gabriela said, stepping forward. "My mother was your sister, Elizabeth." The woman gasped, one hand flying to her mouth. "Elizabeth's child. But we heard the Apache had killed everyone at that settlement years ago." "My father was Apache," Gabriela explained. "He and my mother married. I was born of their union." Martha's expression hardened. "Elizabeth always was headstrong, running off with that." She stopped, seeming to recollect herself. "Well, you'd better come in, I suppose." The reception was cool at best. Martha's husband, a stern-faced banker named Carroll, made no effort to hide his disapproval. They spoke in whispers in the kitchen while Luke and Gabriela sat uncomfortably in the small parlor. "They do not want me here," Gabriela said quietly. "Give them time," Luke suggested, though he had his doubts. "It's a shock to them." Martha returned, hands clasped tightly before her. "We've discussed it," she announced. "You may stay until we can make more suitable arrangements. Perhaps the mission at San Xavier would take you in. They do charitable work with people of your background." Luke felt anger rising in his chest at the woman's thinly veiled rejection, but Gabriela placed a restraining hand on his arm. "Thank you for your hospitality," she said with dignity that made her aunt look away in shame. Luke rose to leave, duty discharged but heart strangely heavy. "I should get back," he said awkwardly. "My boss is expecting me." Outside he mounted Dunn, looking down at Gabriela who stood in the dusty street, suddenly appearing small and vulnerable despite her strength. "You'll be all right?" he asked, knowing the question was inadequate. "I have survived worse," she replied with a small smile that didn't reach her eyes. Luke hesitated, then reached into his pocket and extracted most of his meager savings. "Take this," he said, holding out the money, "in case you need to make other arrangements." Gabriela looked at the offered money but made no move to take it. "I do not need charity, Luke Westfield." "It's not charity," he insisted. But he couldn't find the words to explain what it was. A lifeline, a connection he wasn't ready to sever. "I will be fine," she said firmly. "Go back to your life." With a nod, Luke pocketed the money and turned his horse, riding away with the uncomfortable feeling that he was making a terrible mistake. But what choice did he have? A cowboy with no prospects and a woman caught between two worlds, what future could they possibly share? He rejoined the cattle drive the next day, throwing himself into work with a ferocity that drew comments from his fellow cowboys. "What's got into you, Westfield?" asked Jenkins, an older drover, as Luke volunteered for a double watch for the third night running. "Nothing," Luke replied shortly, "just doing my job." But sleep, when it came, brought dreams of Gabriela, her courage, her wisdom, her eyes across a campfire. He woke each morning more exhausted than when he'd lain down. A week passed. The cattle drive reached its destination, and the men collected their pay. Luke should have felt satisfaction at the weight of coins in his pocket, another step toward his dream of land. Instead, he felt only a hollowness that no amount of whiskey in the celebration at the local saloon could fill. "Planning to head back with us tomorrow?" Thompson asked as they sat at a table, cards spread between them. Luke hesitated. "I thought I might take a few days, visit Tucson." Thompson's eyebrows rose. "That Apache girl still on your mind, is she?" Luke didn't answer, but his silence was confirmation enough. "Be careful, Westfield," Thompson warned. "That's a road that leads nowhere good for either of you." But the next morning, Luke was riding south toward Tucson, his few possessions packed behind his saddle. He told himself he was just checking on Gabriela, making sure she was settled. He owed her that much after what they'd been through together. He found Martha Carroll's house empty, the neighbors explaining that the banker and his wife had left for Phoenix on business 2 days earlier. Of Gabriela, there was no sign. Worry gnawed at Luke as he searched the town. Had she left, gone back to the Apache, been sent to the mission her aunt had mentioned? It wasn't until he checked the small hotel near the stage depot that he got his answer. Miss Asah. Yes, she's been working here, the hotel owner confirmed. Does laundry and helps in the kitchen, room and board plus a small wage. Hard worker, that one, even if she is. He trailed off, perhaps reading the dangerous look in Luke's eyes. Luke found Gabriela in the hotel courtyard, hanging sheets on a line to dry in the desert sun. She wore a simple brown dress, her long hair braided and covered with a kerchief. She looked up as his shadow fell across her work, surprise and something else, something that made Luke's heart skip, flashing across her face. Luke Westfield, she said, straightening. I did not expect to see you again. Neither did I, he admitted, but here I am. They stood in awkward silence for a moment before Gabriela asked, Why have you come back? It was the question Luke had been asking himself for 100 miles, and suddenly he knew the answer with a clarity that surprised him. Because I couldn't stay away, he said simply, because something's been missing since I left you here. Gabriela's expression softened, but she shook her head. We come from different worlds, Luke. Your people and mine. That's just it, Luke interrupted. I don't have people anymore. I've been drifting for years, telling myself I just needed land to call my own, but that's not it. What I need is, he paused, the words unfamiliar in his mouth. What I need is a home, and I think maybe home isn't a place at all, maybe it's a person. Gabriela's eyes widened at his words. Your people would not accept an Apache woman, she said, though Luke could hear the weakening resolve in her voice. I don't care what anyone thinks, Luke replied. I've spent too long worrying about fitting in, about not getting too close to anyone. And where has it gotten me? Nowhere, nothing, empty. He took a step closer. When we were together, fighting those outlaws, making camp, just talking, I felt like I belonged somewhere for the first time since I can remember. Does that make any sense? Gabriela was silent for a long moment. Then, almost in a whisper, she said, With you, I will find my home. The words hung between them, a promise and a question all at once. I have some money saved, Luke said, hope rising in his chest. Not enough for a big spread, but there's land opening up near the Gila River. Good water, good grazing. We could, he stopped, realizing he was getting ahead of himself. That is, if you wanted to. Gabriela smiled then, a genuine smile that lit her entire face. Are you asking me to build a life with you, Luke Westfield? Luke took a deep breath. I am. It won't be easy, people will talk, some will be downright hostile, but we've faced worse together already. Yes, she agreed. We have. So is that a yes? Luke asked, suddenly uncertain. Gabriela stepped forward and took his hands in hers. My father once told me that courage is not the absence of fear, but choosing what is right despite fear. I am afraid, Luke, afraid of rejection, of hardship, of losing what we might build. But I choose courage, I choose you. Luke felt something break open inside him, the walls he had built, the armor he had worn for so long crumbling away. He pulled Gabriela into his arms, holding her as if she might disappear if he let go. There's a preacher in town, he murmured against her hair, if you're sure. Gabriela leaned back to look into his eyes. I am sure. Are you? In answer, Luke kissed her, their first kiss, sweet and tentative at first, then deepening with all the emotion they had kept contained. They were married that same day in the small church at the edge of town. The preacher raised his eyebrows but asked no questions, and the only witnesses were the church caretaker and his wife. Luke wore his cleanest shirt, and Gabriela wore her mother's silver necklace, the only keepsake she had managed to save. The journey to their new beginning took them north along the Gila River, where Luke had heard of land available for homesteading. It was a hard journey through country still contested, but they faced each challenge together, weather, terrain, and the occasional hostile stare from settlers they passed. When they finally found the plot of land Luke had heard about, a small valley with a year-round creek feeding into the Gila, Gabriela stood beside him on a rise overlooking what would become their home. It is beautiful, she said softly. Like my father's stories of the first world. It needs work, Luke cautioned, seeing the valley through practical eyes, the effort it would take to build shelter, to clear fields, to establish a herd. Gabriela smiled. All things worth having require work, my husband. Did you think creating a home would be easy? Luke laughed, pulling her close. Nothing about us has been easy from the start. Why change now? The first year was the hardest. They built a simple cabin with the help of a few friendly neighbors who didn't ask too many questions about Luke's beautiful Apache wife. They planted crops, traded for a few cattle and horses, and worked from dawn until dusk, establishing their claim. There were those who shunned them, traders who refused to deal with a squaw man, women who crossed to the other side of the street when Gabriela came to town for supplies. But there were also those who came to respect their determination, their clear devotion to each other, and the success they gradually carved from the wilderness. Gabriela proved invaluable, her knowledge of native plants supplementing their garden, her skill with leather work and weaving adding to their income. Luke found himself learning from her every day, not just practical skills but a different way of seeing the world, of being in harmony with the land rather than simply exploiting it. By the second year, their homestead was thriving. The cabin had expanded, the herd had grown, and Gabriela's belly had swelled with their first child. Luke found himself watching her in wonder as she moved about their home, singing softly in Apache to the child growing within her. "What are you thinking?" she asked, catching his gaze one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset. "I'm thinking I was a fool," he replied. "For so many years I thought strength meant standing alone. I thought needing someone was weakness." Gabriela took his hand, placing it on her rounded belly where their child kicked vigorously. "And now I know true strength comes from love," he said, the words no longer difficult to speak. "From creating something together that neither could build alone." Their son was born as winter gave way to spring, a strong boy with Luke's blue eyes and Gabriela's black hair, a living bridge between worlds. They named him Thomas after Luke's father, with the Apache name Talasi, corn pollen, to honor Gabriela's heritage. As the years passed, their family and their homestead grew together. 2 more children joined them, daughters who ran wild and free across land that knew no boundaries between white and Apache. Luke and Gabriela taught them to read English books by lamplight and to know the old stories under the stars. There were hard times, droughts that threatened their crops, illness that swept through the valley claiming neighbors, old prejudices that never fully disappeared. But through it all, Luke and Gabriela stood together, their love deepening into something as enduring as the land itself. On their 10th anniversary, Luke took Gabriela back to the rise where they had first viewed their valley. What had once been empty land now held a thriving homestead, a larger house built of adobe and wood, fields of corn and wheat, orchards beginning to bear fruit, and cattle grazing on the hillsides. "Did you ever imagine this?" Luke asked, his arm around his wife's waist. At 35, he had threads of silver in his hair now, lines at the corners of his eyes from squinting in the sun and from laughter. Gabriela, still beautiful at 32, looked out over their creation. "Yes," she said simply, "from the moment you came back for me. I saw our future then." Luke shook his head in wonder. "You always did see farther than me." "Not farther," Gabriela corrected, "just differently. You taught me to build fences to protect what matters. I taught you that the most important boundaries cannot be seen." In the distance, they could hear their children's laughter as they played near the creek. Soon Thomas would be old enough to help with the serious work of the ranch. Their eldest daughter already showed Gabriela's gift with healing plants, while the youngest had Luke's way with horses. "We created a new world," Luke said softly, "not fully Apache, not fully white. Something better." "A home," Gabriela agreed, leaning her head against his shoulder. "Just as I promised you that day in Tucson." As the sun set over their valley, painting the sky in colors no artist could capture, Luke reflected on the journey that had brought them here. He had once believed that the frontier was no place for love, that survival meant isolation, protection meant detachment. How wrong he had been. It was love that had enabled them to survive the frontier's harshness, love that had given them the strength to face drought and disease, prejudice and hardship. It was love that had taught him the true meaning of home. "With you, I found my home," Luke whispered, echoing Gabriela's promise from years ago. She smiled up at him, the same smile that had first broken through his carefully constructed walls. "And I with you, my husband, always." As they walked hand in hand back to their house, to their children, to the life they had built between worlds, Luke knew with absolute certainty that he had found what every man in the West was truly searching for, whether they knew it or not land, not gold, not cattle or glory. A home, a place to belong, and most precious of all, someone to build it with.